Vampire King mocked his loyal waitress as Clingy then lost her voice and begged for years. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. And now, let us return to the main character. Lucian Blackwood had ruled for centuries, long enough that silence obeyed him before servants ever did, long enough that the halls of Blackwood Estate seemed to inhale when he entered and exhale only after he passed. And within that cold rhythm of power there had always been one constant presence that required no command at all: Emily Carter. She moved through the estate like a quiet clock, steady and precise, arriving before the candles dimmed and leaving after the last door was locked, never asking for praise, never expecting gratitude. Her loyalty folded neatly into every small task she completed. Lucian noticed her only in fragments at first, the way one notices the sound of rain only when it stops. A cup placed exactly where he preferred it, a coat ready before he realized the night had turned cold, footsteps that never echoed when he needed to think. To him, Emily was not remarkable, merely consistent, and consistency, in a king's long life, was easily mistaken for something that would never disappear. The others at court whispered that the human waitress lingered too close, that she watched too carefully, that her devotion bordered on something unbecoming, and Lucian, who prided himself on reading loyalty as easily as fear, found a strange curiosity growing where gratitude should have been. He began to test what he assumed was attachment, stretching his patience thin on purpose, dismissing her with sharper words than necessary, watching to see if she would flinch, if she would retreat, or if she would cling tighter, because in his mind loyalty that could not withstand distance was weakness. Emily, however, did not argue or defend herself. She simply adjusted, stepping back when he stepped forward, lowering her gaze when his attention turned cold, absorbing every slight without protest, as if silence itself were her chosen language. When guests filled the hall and laughter bounced against marble walls, Lucian allowed himself a moment of cruelty disguised as honesty, referring to her devotion as bothersome, joking that some people mistook duty for affection, letting the word clingy fall carelessly into the air. He did not look at Emily when he said it, because he assumed he did not need to. He assumed she would still be there when the night ended, as she always was. What he failed to notice was the way her hands stilled, the way her breath caught, the way the weight of that single word pressed heavier than years of quiet service. Emily did not leave immediately. She finished what she had started, straightened what needed straightening, closed doors softly, and when she finally stepped out of the estate, the night swallowed her without ceremony. Lucian returned to his chambers unaware that something essential had shifted, that a presence he had taken for granted had fractured, and in that moment of careless certainty, the Vampire King remained powerful, untouched, and utterly ignorant of the cost that would soon follow. The absence did not announce itself loudly at first. It slipped into the estate the way cold air does, unnoticed until everything feels wrong, and Lucian Blackwood went about his nights assuming Emily Carter would return once her mood settled, because people always did when they depended on his world. The first sign was trivial, a detail so small he dismissed it without thought. The cup of tea left untouched at the edge of his desk, cooling past the point she would have allowed, the steam long gone before he realized he had not called for it. Later, a meeting stretched longer than planned, and when he stood to leave, his coat was not there, not draped across the chair the way it always was, not waiting in his hands before he noticed the chill of stone walls against his skin. Servants scrambled to correct these things once he spoke, too quickly, too nervously, asking questions Emily used to answer without being asked, and Lucian felt an irritation settle into his chest that had nothing to do with inconvenience. He told himself she was being dramatic, that humans often mistook correction for cruelty, that silence was a childish response to words meant to remind her of her place. Days passed then, weeks, and the rhythm of the estate faltered in subtle ways. Footsteps echoed when they should not have, doors creaked instead of closing softly, and tasks were done efficiently, but without the quiet care that had once gone unnoticed. Lucian caught himself listening for her presence, for the faint sound of movement just behind him, and when it did not come, he felt an unfamiliar tension coil beneath his composure. He asked after her at last, casually, as if her name meant nothing, and the answer unsettled him more than he expected. No one had seen Emily since the night she left. No farewell, no demand for wages owed, no explanation offered. Only her room cleared of the few possessions she had carried into the estate, folded neatly as though she intended never to return. Lucian dismissed the servants and stood alone in the corridor, staring at a closed door he had never once opened, realizing too late that he had never known where she went when her work was done, never asked what she needed beyond instruction. He told himself she would come back, that loyalty like hers did not vanish, but when weeks turned into months, and her absence remained absolute, something colder than anger settled into him. Rumors reached his court eventually, quiet ones, spoken carefully, that the waitress who once served the vampire king no longer spoke, that her voice had failed her shortly after she left, leaving her to communicate only through writing or gesture, and Lucian dismissed the first whisper as coincidence, then the second as exaggeration, until the third struck too close to ignore. He remembered the way she had stood in silence when he mocked her devotion, the way she had accepted his words without protest, and for the first time in centuries, Lucian felt the uncomfortable weight of doubt. He ordered inquiries made, not with urgency, but with an unease he refused to name, and each report returned the same empty truth. Emily Carter lived quietly somewhere beyond his reach, unseen, unheard, and unwilling to be found. Nights grew longer, not because time changed, but because regret stretched it, and Lucian found himself standing in rooms that felt larger without her, replaying a moment he had dismissed as insignificant, the careless ease with which he had reduced loyalty to weakness. Power still bowed to him, the estate still answered his commands. But something essential no longer did, and in that growing silence, Lucian began to understand that what he had tested was never her devotion, but the limits of his own, and that realization settled into him with a heaviness no crown could lift. Lucian Blackwood had always believed that time dulled everything, that centuries had proven loss eventually softened into memory, but Emily Carter proved him wrong in a way nothing else ever had. As months bled quietly into years, the silence she left behind did not fade. It sharpened, cutting into moments that once felt ordinary. He found himself pausing before issuing commands she used to anticipate, correcting servants for mistakes she would never have made, and standing alone at night in rooms that felt too large without her steady presence. The estate still functioned, flawlessly by most standards, yet Lucian sensed the difference the way one senses an approaching storm, subtle but unavoidable. He ordered deeper searches, extending beyond his territories, sending inquiries through cities and towns measured in miles rather than whispers, not as a king demanding obedience, but as something dangerously close to desperation. The reports returned slowly, fragments stitched together from cautious voices, confirming what he already feared. Emily lived quietly now, far from power, far from him, and she did not speak. The loss of her voice was not dramatic, not accompanied by spectacle or explanation. It was simply gone, leaving behind a stillness that followed her everywhere. Some said it happened overnight. Others claimed it faded after she left the estate, but all agreed on one thing. She had not sought help from anyone who could lead Lucian to her. The realization struck deeper than any insult ever had. She was not hiding. She was choosing a life without him. Lucian began to remember moments he once dismissed, the way she listened more than she spoke, the care with which she chose her words, and how easily he had taken that restraint for weakness. He remembered her eyes on the night he mocked her loyalty, not hurt in the way he understood, but resolved, as though something inside her had quietly closed. That memory followed him relentlessly, replaying itself in the still hours before dawn, when even a vampire king could not command his thoughts to silence. He returned to the corridor outside her old room more often than he admitted, standing before the closed door, imagining the faint sounds of her presence that would never return. Pride had once kept him from seeking her himself, from acknowledging that his words had cut deeper than intended, but pride eroded under the weight of years, and regret took its place. When Lucian finally found her, It was not through power or force, but through patience he had learned too late, tracing her movements through records and chance encounters until he stood at the edge of a small town far removed from his world. He watched her from a distance at first, seeing how she moved through her days, quieter than before, communicating with gentle gestures and written notes, her expression calm but guarded. The sight of her alive and changed struck him harder than any imagined punishment, because she did not look broken, she looked free. When he stepped forward and spoke her name, his voice steady despite the storm beneath it, Emily turned slowly, recognition flickering across her face without relief or anger. She did not answer, could not answer, but the silence between them was heavier than words. Lucian lowered himself before her, not as a king, but as a man who finally understood the cost of his arrogance, and for the first time in centuries, he begged without command, knowing that no amount of power could restore what his carelessness had taken, and that forgiveness, like loyalty, could never be demanded, only given if it chose to return. Emily did not step back when Lucian knelt before her, but she did not step forward either, and that distance, no more than a few feet of worn sidewalk between them, felt wider than any throne room he had ever ruled. The town moved quietly around them, ordinary sounds filling the air, a passing car, a door closing, footsteps fading down the street, and Lucian realized with painful clarity that the world continued perfectly well without him at its center. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word carried weight he could not afford to waste, apologizing not with excuses, but with acknowledgement, naming his cruelty for what it was, admitting that he had confused loyalty with something owed and silence with weakness. Emily listened without interrupting, her face calm, her eyes steady, and when he finished, she reached for a small notebook she carried, writing with deliberate care before turning it toward him. The words were simple, written in a neat hand, saying that she had not lost her voice because of him alone, but because she had learned too late that speaking for others while never speaking for herself came with a cost. Lucian felt the truth of it settle into him, heavy and deserved. He asked nothing of her then, did not beg again, did not demand forgiveness, and when she turned away to return to her modest home, he let her go, because he was finally learning that restraint was not weakness either. He did not leave the town after that day, choosing instead a small place on its edge, far from luxury, far from his estate, and for the first time in his long existence, Lucian lived without being recognized. Days passed measured in hours rather than centuries, and he watched Emily from a respectful distance, seeing how she moved through her life now, working quietly, helping when she chose to, refusing when she needed to, her silence no longer submission but boundary. He returned each morning to the same bench across the street from her workplace, not to be seen, but to remain, a presence that asked nothing. Seasons shifted, marked by the change of light and temperature, and Lucian stayed through them all, learning patience that could not be commanded into existence. Occasionally, Emily acknowledged him with a nod, sometimes with a few written words exchanged briefly, never unkind, never inviting, and Lucian accepted each small interaction as more than he deserved. Years passed this way, and stories spread quietly of a man who waited without asking, who helped the town without revealing his means, who never spoke of where he came from or what he had lost. Lucian did not count the time, but he felt its passage in ways he never had before, in the ache of regret that did not lessen, in the hope he refused to nurture too quickly. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the street, Emily stopped beside him longer than usual and wrote a single sentence, saying that forgiveness was not a destination, but a process, and that silence could heal, but only if it was chosen, not imposed. Lucian read the words carefully, then nodded, understanding that this was not an ending or a beginning, but something far more difficult, awaiting. Shaped by humility, and as Emily walked away, her steps steady and unburdened, Lucian remained where he was, resolved to wait for as long as it took, even if the rest of his immortal life was the price of learning too late what loyalty had always been. Time became something different after that. No longer an enemy Lucian could outrun, nor a servant he could command, but a quiet companion that demanded consistency. He remained in the town through changing weather and small routines, learning the weight of ordinary days measured by errands and shared glances rather than decrees. Emily continued her life with steady resolve, her silence neither fragile nor theatrical, and Lucian learned to recognize the strength in it, the way she chose when to engage and when to step back, the way her written words carried intention rather than apology. He helped where help was needed without revealing more than necessary, repairing a fence after a storm, funding repairs quietly, listening when neighbors spoke without offering solutions they did not ask for. The townspeople came to trust him not because of charm or authority, but because he returned each day and kept his word. Emily noticed this in small ways, in how children waved to him, in how store owners nodded, and though she did not invite him closer, she did not ask him to leave. One afternoon, months after their first meeting, she placed a folded note beside him on the bench, explaining that she had found peace in choosing a life where her worth did not depend on being needed, and that the loss of her voice had forced her to hear herself clearly for the first time. Lucian read the note twice, absorbing the meaning he would have dismissed in another age, and responded with a single sentence written carefully, acknowledging that he had learned too late that loyalty grows only where respect is practiced. From then on, their exchanges became occasional and honest, never hurried, never promised. Lucian did not speak of restoration or magic, though he possessed both, because he understood that returning what was taken could never erase why it was lost. As years passed, he remained unchanged while the town subtly shifted around him, and Emily aged with a grace that came from living within boundaries she had chosen. One winter evening, she wrote that she no longer resented the silence, that it had become a space where she felt safe, and Lucian felt a bittersweet relief knowing that her healing did not depend on his redemption. He continued to wait, not for forgiveness owed, but for the chance to be present without expectation. When spring arrived again, Emily sat beside him for the first time, not as a concession, but as a choice, and she wrote that trust could return in forms that did not resemble the past. Lucian nodded, understanding that what they were building was not a restoration, but something quieter and more honest. He did not reach for her hand or promise devotion, because he knew now that true loyalty was not declared, it was demonstrated over time. The town settled into a rhythm that included them both, separate yet connected by shared space and mutual respect, and Lucian accepted that this, too, was a kind of grace. He had lost years begging for what he once dismissed, and gained something far rarer in return, the understanding that power could kneel without losing dignity, and that love, when it returned at all, did so only when invited by patience and humility. The balance they settled into did not erase the past, but it reshaped it, and Lucian learned that restraint demanded more strength than command ever had. He remained a quiet fixture in the town, present without claiming space, watching Emily move through her days with a calm assurance that no longer bent toward him. She wrote to him occasionally, not explanations or confessions, but observations about weather, about work, about moments that mattered because they were chosen, and Lucian responded in the same careful way, never asking for more than she offered. Years passed like this, marked not by dates but by habits, by the way people greeted them together without assuming intimacy, by the ease of shared silence on the bench they both seemed to favor. Lucian no longer counted how long he had waited, because waiting itself had become part of who he was, a discipline he practiced daily. When whispers of his former life reached the town, distant and distorted, he did not correct them, allowing the past to remain where it belonged. Emily noticed the change in him more clearly than anyone, not in grand gestures, but in the way he listened without interrupting, the way he accepted boundaries without resentment, the way he remained when leaving would have been easier. One evening, she wrote that forgiveness did not require forgetting, and Lucian felt gratitude not for absolution, but for honesty. He understood then that what she offered was not restoration, but recognition, an acknowledgement that he had learned and paid the cost of learning. Their connection deepened quietly, not through declarations, but through shared routines, occasional walks measured in miles rather than promises, and conversations written and read with patience. Lucian never suggested returning her voice, though the thought lingered like a temptation, because he knew that offering power where consent was uncertain would only repeat the harm he sought to undo. Emily, in turn, did not ask for it. having made peace with the silence she now owned. When she sat beside him and wrote that she trusted him, not because he was powerful, but because he was consistent, Lucian felt something settle within him that centuries of rule had never provided. He remained vigilant, not against threats, but against himself, aware that humility was not a state achieved once, but a practice maintained daily. The town grew accustomed to their quiet presence, seeing them as they were, two figures bound by history but living in the present. Lucian realized that even if forgiveness never fully arrived, this life, built on respect and patience, was more than he deserved and more than he had ever known how to create. As another year passed, he accepted that the greatest penance was not suffering, but transformation, and that some losses were meant to remain as reminders rather than wounds to be healed. In Emily's steady gaze and deliberate silence, Lucian found the clearest measure of redemption he would ever be granted, not the return of what was lost, but the permission to remain, changed and accountable, in the quiet space they now shared. The years that followed settled into a pattern neither of them named, but both respected, a quiet understanding shaped by time rather than promises. Lucian remained unchanged by age, yet altered in every way that mattered. While Emily continued to grow into herself, her silence no longer a shadow but a choice that gave her control. The town accepted this without question, seeing them as constants, two figures who belonged without explanation. One autumn afternoon, Emily handed Lucian a note that spoke of memory, of how the past no longer hurt the way it once had, but remained present, a reminder rather than a wound. Lucian read it slowly, understanding that this was not forgiveness offered freely, but a sign that healing had made space for truth. He responded by writing that regret had taught him patience, and patience had taught him humility, lessons no crown had ever provided. Their walks grew longer, measured in miles along quiet roads, and their silences felt companionable rather than strained. Lucian listened as Emily shared fragments of her life through written words, her hopes no longer defined by service, her identity no longer shaped by being needed. He never interrupted, never redirected, knowing that listening was the only role he had earned. When winter returned, Emily wrote that she trusted him fully now, not as a king or a savior, but as someone who had learned how to stay without taking. That trust carried weight, heavier than forgiveness would have been, and Lucian accepted it with care. He continued to resist the temptation to restore what was lost, understanding that power offered without request was still a violation. Emily never asked for her voice back, and Lucian respected that choice, recognizing that healing could not be measured by what was undone. One evening, as the town gathered for a quiet celebration, Emily stood beside him and wrote that some endings were meant to remain unfinished, not as punishment, but as proof of growth. Lucian nodded, realizing that his role was not to seek closure, but to honor the process that brought them here. The town saw them together, not as a story resolved, but as one lived honestly, shaped by accountability rather than fantasy. Lucian felt a peace he had never known, not because the past was forgiven, but because it was no longer denied. He understood now that loyalty given freely was sacred, and that silence, when chosen, could be powerful rather than broken. As the night settled around them, Lucian accepted that some losses could not be reversed, only respected, and that true redemption was not found in reclaiming what was lost, but in becoming someone worthy of trust. Emily's presence beside him, steady and unafraid, was not a reward, but a reminder of what patience and humility could build. And in that shared quiet, Lucian finally understood that the greatest change was not the one he had waited centuries to achieve, but the one he had practiced every day since learning how deeply words could wound, and how long it took for silence to heal. The shift came quietly, as most important changes did, without announcement or ceremony, and Lucian sensed it before Emily ever acknowledged it. She began to look at him differently, not with caution or measured distance, but with a calm awareness that no longer needed constant evaluation. One afternoon, she handed him a note that spoke of choice, of how trust had grown not because the past was repaired, but because the present had proven safe. Lucian read it carefully, understanding that this moment was not an invitation to reclaim what was lost, but an opening to stand beside her without conditions. He wrote back that he would never ask her to be what she once was, and that if she chose to remain as she was now, he would honor that fully. Emily smiled at that, a small expression that carried more weight than words ever had, and Lucian felt the significance of it settle deep within him. Their days continued much as before, but something subtle had shifted, an ease that no longer required vigilance, a closeness that did not threaten her autonomy. When Emily invited him to walk with her through a quiet stretch of town she had always traveled alone, Lucian accepted without comment, matching her pace, listening as she shared thoughts written carefully, about how silence had reshaped her sense of self, about how losing her voice had taught her to hear her own needs clearly. Lucian responded only when asked, offering presence rather than solutions, and she seemed to appreciate that restraint more than any promise. As dusk settled around them, Emily stopped and wrote that she had once believed her voice was taken from her, but now understood that it had returned in a different form, one that could not be dismissed or mocked. Lucian felt both sorrow and gratitude, recognizing that her strength had grown from the very wound he caused. He did not ask if she wanted her voice restored, because he had learned that some questions carried pressure simply by being asked. Instead, he wrote that he respected her choice completely, and that whatever she needed, silence or speech, distance or closeness, he would follow her lead. Emily read his words, then wrote something that made his breath still, explaining that she did not fear speaking again, but that she no longer wished to use her voice to earn belonging. Lucian nodded, understanding that this was not rejection, but clarity. When she reached out and placed her hand briefly against his arm, the gesture was gentle and deliberate, free of obligation, and Lucian understood that trust had reached a new depth. He did not move closer or linger beyond the moment, allowing her to withdraw without consequence. That night, Lucian reflected on how easily he once believed power could fix what was broken, and how wrong he had been. The town remained quiet, unchanged, yet everything felt different, because he was different. Emily's presence beside him was no longer defined by history, but by intention, and Lucian accepted that this was the truest resolution he could hope for. He did not know what the future would hold, whether her voice would ever return or whether silence would remain her chosen language. But for the first time, he understood that love was not measured by restoration, but by respect. And in that understanding, Lucian found peace not because the past was undone, but because it no longer controlled what came next. The final shape of their story did not arrive with certainty or resolution, but with acceptance, and Lucian understood that this was the only ending that could be honest. Years had passed since he first knelt before Emily in desperation, and in that time he had learned that waiting was not a pause between actions, but an action itself. Emily continued to live as she chose, her silence steady and intentional, her presence calm, and Lucian remained beside her without claiming more than she offered. The town no longer questioned their bond, seeing it not as romance or penance, but as a quiet companionship built on trust earned slowly. One evening, as the light faded and the familiar bench cast long shadows across the sidewalk, Emily handed Lucian a final note, not dramatic or emotional, but clear. She wrote that she no longer carried resentment, that the past no longer held power over her choices, and that her silence was no longer something she endured, but something she owned. Lucian read the words carefully, feeling both relief and humility, because they did not grant him absolution, only understanding. He responded with equal care, writing that he accepted whatever place she allowed him, and that he would never again mistake patience for permission or loyalty for obligation. Emily nodded, and for a moment they simply sat together, the world moving quietly around them. Lucian did not ask about the future, because he had learned that true respect did not rush answers. When Emily stood to leave, she paused, then wrote one last line, explaining that forgiveness did not mean returning to what was, but recognizing what had changed. Lucian watched her walk away, not with fear of loss, but with gratitude for what remained. He understood then that his begging years had not been a path back to power, but a path away from it, toward accountability. The vampire king who once ruled through command now measured his worth by restraint, by the discipline of honoring another person's boundaries without resentment. Emily's voice did not return in the way stories often promised, and Lucian did not seek to restore it, because both of them understood that not all losses were meant to be undone. Some existed to teach, to remind, to ensure growth was permanent rather than convenient. Lucian returned to his estate only rarely, delegating power without regret, because the life he had built here required no throne. He remained present in the town, known not for his past, but for his consistency, and that was enough. In the quiet that followed, Lucian finally accepted the truth that had eluded him for centuries, that love was not proven through sacrifice demanded, but through respect maintained, and that the deepest regrets were not those that broke loudly, but those that taught too late. Emily's silence remained, steady and strong, and Lucian's devotion remained as well, no longer desperate, no longer loud, but rooted in humility. And in that quiet ending, there was no triumph, no reunion promised, only a hard-earned peace, and the understanding that some kings only learn the value of loyalty after silence takes everything away.